No student had ever solved it. The final exam, the teacher's pride, his unbreakable wall, and yet when he vowed to resign if anyone scored a perfect 100, every gaze turned toward the boy with mud still clinging to his boots. The boy who had never owned a textbook, but carried in his heart the quiet fire of genius. Ethan Miller, 12 years old, a farmhand's son. That moment would not only shake the class, it would rattle the very foundation of American education. The story begins on a crisp morning in the small riverside town. Riverside Middle School stood on a hill, its old red brick walls touched by decades of sunlight and storm. To the families of the town, it was a beacon of pride, the school that had sent children to colleges far away, toward futures that gleamed brighter than the cornfields. But for Ethan Miller, stepping into that building was never simple. He came with boots still damp from the muddy fields, with hands marked by calluses from farm chores. He carried no prestige, no polished heritage, only a quiet mind, sharper than the blades his father used to cut hay. That morning, in the advanced mathematics class, sunlight streamed across rows of polished desks. Mr. Richard Whitmore, the man who had ruled this classroom for 30 years, walked in with his heavy steps. He was tall, with silver hair neatly parted, glasses that caught the light, and a presence that filled the room like a cold wind. He turned to the chalkboard, tapped a piece of chalk against it, and let his voice fall like a gavel. "Class," he began, "this year's final examination will not be ordinary. It will not simply measure what is written in textbooks. It will test the very limits of your intellect." The room fell into silence. Even the creaking ceiling fan seemed to slow its spin. Then his eyes, sharp as knives, sought one student in particular, Ethan Miller. And in that moment, Mr. Whitmore delivered a decree that would set the entire school whispering for weeks. To silence any doubt, I offer this challenge. If anyone, any student scores a perfect 100 on my exam, I will resign my position and never teach again. But if you, Ethan Miller, fail, then you will leave this advanced class for good. The room froze. A pencil clattered onto the floor, and no one dared to pick it up. The words hung in the air like a sentence passed down in a courtroom. All eyes turned toward the boy in the back row. Ethan sat still, shoulders narrow beneath a plain shirt, mud stains faintly visible on his boots. His hands, rough and worn, rested quietly on the desk. But his eyes, deep, steady, like the dark surface of a midnight pond, did not flinch. For a moment, memories surged through him. His father bent over the plow, his mother mending clothes by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, the brother he had lost in a farm accident. He thought of the land, the sweat, the endless cycle of planting and harvest. And he thought of the way people in town spoke of them, as if poverty meant inferiority. He could not allow that to be the final word. Slowly, Ethan rose to his feet. His voice was soft, but it carried through the room with the gravity of something inevitable. "I accept." Gasps rippled through the class. It was not the volume of his words, but the calm certainty within them that unsettled everyone. Mr. Whitmore's lips curled into a thin smile, one that held both challenge and disdain. "So be it," he said. "Then all shall witness." The lesson continued, but no one truly heard it. For Ethan, something within had already shifted. A fire had been lit. During the break, whispers darted across the hallways. "He's crazy," one student muttered. "No one has ever scored 100 on Whitmore's exams." "Especially not that farm kid." Ethan heard it all. He did not answer. He simply walked, steady and quiet, to the back steps of the school where the sun warmed the old stone steps. There, as if waiting, stood the old janitor, Mr. James. Bent with age, his back curved, his hair a tangle of silver, he leaned on his mop. His eyes, though, were not dim. They glimmered with something unspoken. "I heard," Mr. James said, his voice raspy, carrying both fatigue and warmth. "You're choosing to climb a mountain." Ethan nodded. "If I back down, they'll think kids like me will never be worthy." The old man studied him for a long moment. Then he gave a weary smile, one tinged with sorrow. "Then perhaps you are the chance I've been waiting for." He said no more, but in his gaze was the weight of history, of a man who had seen injustice and had carried the silence of it for too long. That afternoon, Ethan returned home. His father was repairing the old wooden fence by the barn, sweat darkening his shirt. He looked up when Ethan approached. "How was school today?" the father asked, wiping his brow with a calloused hand. Ethan hesitated, then told him about the challenge. The father was quiet for a long while. Then he laid a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't need to prove yourself to any teacher," he said. "But if you choose to fight this battle, do it for yourself. Do it for the dream your brother never got to finish." From the doorway his mother stepped out, a cloth still in her hand. Her eyes softened as they fell on Ethan. "We believe in you, but remember, you are still a child. Do not let your heart harden just because of one man's pride." Ethan said nothing, but in his silence, love and determination mingled, flowing into him like a hidden spring feeding the roots of a tree. That night, when the farmhouse had grown quiet, Ethan lit the small kerosene lamp in his room. He pulled out worn notebooks, their pages already frayed at the edges. His hand trembled as he picked up the pencil, but his eyes glowed, alive with something fierce. Numbers spread across the paper. Equations, clumsy at first, then steadier, then stronger. The night air was filled only with the scratch of pencil against paper and the distant chorus of crickets. In that moment, he was no longer simply a boy from a farm. He was a challenger standing before a wall built over decades, and he was ready to chip away at it, one problem at a time. The next day, the school bustled as usual. Mr. Whitmore strode the halls with his usual authority, his shadow long against the lockers. Yet in a quieter corner, Mr. James leaned on his mop, watching Ethan with eyes that carried secrets of a past unspoken. The old janitor had once been more than a keeper of halls, and as he watched the farm boy walk by with steady steps, he knew. The time had come to pass on the torch he had kept hidden all these years. The true story, the one that would spread far beyond the red brick walls of Riverside Middle School, had only just begun. It began with a challenge, spoken in arrogance by a proud teacher, and it began with a boy of 12 who answered not with anger, but with calm resolve. That challenge would not simply decide the fate of one child. It would stir questions about learning, fairness, and hope itself. And it would echo far beyond this little town, into places where truth was waiting to be heard. The farm stretched wide beneath the September sky, the fields browned by the sun, the fences leaning tiredly from years of wind and rain. This was Ethan's world when the school bell faded into memory, the world of mud, hay, and heavy boots. That evening, after the challenge had been spoken in the classroom, Ethan returned to the Miller farm with a silence that felt heavier than his small frame. His father was already at work, mending the wooden gate where the sheep had pressed too often. His mother hummed faintly in the kitchen, preparing stew with the last of the garden's carrots. Life here had no space for pride or arrogance. It was measured in broken tools and long winters, in how many bales of hay could be stacked before the frost came. Ethan dropped his school bag on the porch and went straight to the barn. The animals bleated, restless for their evening feed. He filled the trough with grain, his hands moving by instinct, his thoughts elsewhere. With each scoop of grain, he remembered the moment in class. Whitmore's voice, cold and final, the snickers of other students. But louder still was the image of his father's back bent over the fields, the lines carved into his mother's face, the empty chair at the kitchen table where his brother should have been. It was his brother Daniel who had taught him first numbers, drawing them with a stick in the dirt while they waited for sheep to graze. Daniel had dreamed of studying engineering, of building machines that might ease the labor of their parents. But one rainy afternoon, a tractor overturned, and the dream was buried in the same earth they tilled. Ethan still heard his brother's voice sometimes, carried by the wind across the fields. Don't just work the land, Ethan. Understand it. Learn the patterns, the shapes. That's how you make life easier. Now, standing in the barn, he clenched his fists. He had promised, quietly, to live for more than one. After chores, the family gathered at the wooden table. The stew was thin, the bread hard, but the warmth of the fire filled the room. His father sat silently, his rough hands wrapped around a chipped mug. His mother glanced at Ethan, reading in his eyes what he could not yet say. "You're thinking about it?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. "If I fail, they'll say it proves everything they already believe, that farm kids don't belong in their world." His father's voice rumbled low. "Let them say what they want. Our worth isn't decided in their classrooms." But Ethan shook his head. "It matters, not just for me, for every kid who gets laughed at because of where they come from." The fire crackled. His father looked at him long, then sighed. "When I was your age, I left school to work these fields. Not because I was less capable, but because the land demanded it. If you've been given a chance to keep learning, take it. But never forget, you do it with humility, not with bitterness." His mother reached across the table, taking Ethan's hand in her own. "Carry us with you, but don't carry our burdens as chains. Let them be your roots." That night, Ethan walked out to the pasture. The sky was deep with stars, scattered like equations across a dark chalkboard. The air smelled of hay and cold earth. He sat on the wooden fence and gazed upward. To anyone else, the stars were just pinpricks of light. But to Ethan, they were patterns, constellations that whispered of geometry, distances, orbits. He had read once, in an old library book, that the universe itself was written in the language of mathematics. He imagined Daniel beside him, pointing at the stars, daring him to solve riddles hidden in the heavens. "I'll try," Ethan murmured into the night. "I'll carry your dream, too." The following days unfolded in rhythm. Morning chores before school, milking cows, drawing water from the well, school hours filled with lectures where Whitmore's eyes burned holes into him. Afternoons back at the farm, stacking hay bales until his arms ached. And then the nights, those precious, silent nights when he opened his notebook by lamplight and wrestled with numbers. His parents did not always understand the symbols on his pages, but they understood the devotion in his posture. They left him to his lamp, his pencil, his long hours. Sometimes his father would pause at the door and simply watch. The boy bent over his desk, fighting equations the way a farmer fights the soil, patient and relentless. And in those moments, the father felt both fear and pride. Fear that his son was stepping into a world he could not guide, pride that perhaps, just perhaps, the cycle of toil might break. One evening, as Ethan struggled with a particularly dense problem from a borrowed textbook, he heard the creak of the barn door. Mr. James, the janitor, stepped inside, carrying a wooden crate. "I thought this might help," the old man said softly. Inside the crate were worn books, algebra, geometry, even a dusty volume of number theory. Ethan's eyes widened. "Where did you get these?" James hesitated. "Once, a long time ago, they were mine." The boy looked up, puzzled. The old man smiled faintly. I was not always a janitor, but the world does not always reward honesty. Still, knowledge is not mine to keep. It is a torch, and torches are meant to be passed on. He placed the crate beside Ethan's desk. Learn not to crush Whitmore, but to free yourself. Ethan touched the cracked spines reverently, as though he had been handed treasure. "I'll try," he whispered. "No," James said firmly, his old eyes shining. "You will do more than try. You will prove that brilliance can bloom in the dust of the fields." And so the rhythm deepened. By day, the boy carried buckets of water, his arms trembling under the weight. By night, he carried symbols and proofs across paper, his mind burning with questions that outstripped his years. It was not easy. Sometimes exhaustion nearly conquered him. Sometimes frustration knotted his chest when a problem refused to yield. But in those hours, he remembered his father's voice, his mother's faith, and his brother's unfinished dream. He was not solving equations for grades. He was carving a path, through prejudice, through poverty, through the wall Whitmore had built to keep boys like him outside. And as autumn deepened, the fields grew bare. But inside the Miller farmhouse, a harvest of another kind was taking root. A boy was preparing, not merely for an exam, but for a reckoning that would shake far more than one classroom. The stars above the fields glittered, patient witnesses to a farm boy's quiet vow. The vow that mud and calluses would not define him. The vow that genius could rise from the humblest soil. The vow that when the moment came, he would stand unshaken. And in the silence of the farmyard, Ethan Miller sharpened not only his pencil, but his destiny. The corridors of Riverside Middle School always smelled faintly of chalk and floor polish. To most students, the figure of Mr. James, the janitor, was little more than background, an old man pushing his mop, head bowed, invisible as the scuffed tiles he scrubbed. But for Ethan Miller, the boy from the farm, silence had sharpened his eyes. He noticed what others did not. Mr. James moved differently from other janitors. His steps were measured, his gaze thoughtful. Sometimes Ethan caught him pausing near the bulletin boards, reading the math club announcements longer than anyone else. There was a precision in his gestures, the way he handled tools, as though every sweep of the mop were a calculation. One chilly afternoon, after class had emptied and the halls grew still, Ethan lingered by his locker, stuffing worn notebooks into his bag. Mr. James approached, carrying a wooden crate that looked heavy for his frail frame. He set it down with care. "I believe," the old man said, his voice low but steady, "that these might belong to you more than they belong to me." Ethan frowned, curious. He bent over the crate. Inside were books, thick, leather-bound, their pages yellowed by time. Titles gleamed faintly. Linear algebra, Euclidean geometry, introduction to number theory, mathematical proofs of the 20th century. His breath caught. These were not the school's usual textbooks. They were advanced, written in a language that hinted at worlds far beyond his grade. "Why are you giving me these?" Ethan asked softly. For a moment, the janitor said nothing. Then he leaned against his mop, his face shadowed by memories too heavy to carry alone. "Because once," he began, "I stood where you stand now. A boy with dirt on his hands but light in his mind. I became a professor of mathematics. For years I lectured in halls much grander than this school. And then one day I was asked to lie." Ethan's eyes widened. James's voice grew rough like gravel underfoot. "A government official wanted his son to pass my course. He had no talent, no discipline. They asked me to alter his grade. I refused. That refusal cost me everything. They buried me with accusations, stripped me of my position. Doors closed, friends vanished. And so, here I am, mopping floors. Silence filled the hallway. Only the distant ticking of a classroom clock could be heard. But, James continued, his eyes sharpening, they could not erase what I had learned. They could not silence my mind. And knowledge is not meant to die with bitterness. It is meant to be handed forward. He pushed the crate closer to Ethan. Take them. Learn from them. Let them guide you. The exam your teacher has prepared will not be fair. It will be designed to humiliate. But if you walk with truth and clarity, no trick can defeat you. Ethan touched the books with reverence, as though they were relics. His heart pounded. You're offering me everything you have left, he whispered. James shook his head. No. I'm offering you what was never mine to keep. Mathematics is not a fortress for the privileged. It is a field for all who are willing to sow. You, farm boy, already know how to sow. Ethan felt something shift deep inside. For the first time since Whitmore's challenge, he felt he was not alone. That evening, back on the farm, Ethan carried the crate to his small desk under the eaves. The lamplight flickered as he opened the first volume. The words were difficult, dense with symbols and unfamiliar terms. But beside him, he heard James's earlier words. Walk with truth and clarity. He set his jaw, picked up his pencil, and began. Hours slipped by. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, and the barn creaked in the dark. Inside, Ethan wrestled with problems that seemed at first impossible. Proofs unfolded across the page like winding roads. Some led nowhere. Others opened like doors to chambers he had never imagined. He learned that mathematics was not only about answers, but about ways of thinking, about patience, logic, and seeing patterns hidden beneath the ordinary. It was like tending the farm. Water the soil day after day, and one day, the harvest arrives. At times, frustration overcame him. Equations blurred, his eyelids drooped. But then he remembered Daniel, his brother, sketching numbers in the dirt. He remembered his mother's voice, telling him to carry their roots. He remembered his father's hand on his shoulder, and he pressed on. Weeks passed. Ethan began meeting James in secret corners of the school, the supply closet, the boiler room, the empty gym after hours. The old man guided him through concepts step by step, his teaching style unlike Whitmore's. Where Whitmore wielded math like a weapon, James offered it like a lantern. Consider prime numbers, James said one evening, chalk in hand. They are the atoms of arithmetic, indivisible, unique. Entire worlds of mathematics rest upon them. Some problems about them have remained unsolved for centuries. Take the Riemann hypothesis. It proposes that the primes follow a hidden rhythm, a music of the infinite. No one has proven it, not yet. Ethan listened with wide eyes. And do you believe it's true? James smiled faintly. Belief is for churches. Mathematics asks not for belief, but for proof. Yet sometimes the search itself is the faith we live by. The boy nodded slowly, absorbing not only numbers, but wisdom. Another night, James spoke of geometry. You see those farm fields of yours, laid out in rows? Geometry is the same. It is the discipline of space, of shape, of how the world arranges itself. Once men built cathedrals with nothing but these principles. You too may build with them, though your cathedral may be invisible, a cathedral of thought. Ethan smiled quietly. For the first time he felt mathematics was not foreign. It was his. It lived in the rows of corn, in the circles of wagon wheels, in the stars above the pasture. But as Ethan's understanding deepened, so too did the danger. Whitmore began to notice the boy's growing confidence. His tests, designed to confuse, no longer shook Ethan. The teacher's eyes narrowed with suspicion. One afternoon, Whitmore stopped him in the hallway. "Enjoying yourself, Miller?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ethan kept his eyes steady. "I'm learning." Whitmore leaned close. "Learning will not save you. When the day comes, the exam will break you. Remember that." Ethan said nothing, but inside his resolve hardened. He knew Whitmore was preparing a trap, but he also knew he was no longer the same boy who had once sat in silence at the back of the room. He carried now not only his family's hopes, but also the legacy of a fallen professor turned janitor. Late one night, after Ethan had finally solved a problem that had haunted him for days, he closed the book and sat back. The lamp flickered, shadows dancing on the walls. He thought of James, of the risks the old man was taking in guiding him. He thought of Whitmore, sharpening his challenge. Most of all, he thought of the exam that awaited. Ethan whispered into the dark, "I won't fail. Not for me. Not for Daniel. Not for anyone who's been told they are less." And outside, the wind swept across the empty fields, carrying his vow into the night. The farm boy was no longer alone. He had found a mentor in the shadows, a torchbearer in the most unlikely of places. Together, they were preparing not just for a test, but for a battle between arrogance and truth. The janitor, once silenced, had found his voice again in the boy who refused to bow. And in that partnership, a storm was beginning to gather. By day, Ethan Miller was a farmhand's son. His mornings began before dawn, when the rooster's cry split the silence and the chill of dew clung to the fields. He would pull on the same worn boots, tug the rope of the well to draw up water, and help his father milk the cows. His hands, small but tough, grew red in the cold as he worked the iron pump handle. The farm had no patience for excuses. Cattle needed feeding, fences needed mending, hay needed stacking. No teacher, no test, no dream of numbers could delay these tasks. Ethan learned early that survival meant discipline. Each chore must be done, each step steady, no matter how tired he felt. Yet when the sun dipped behind the trees and the chores were finished, another labor began. Ethan carried his books, the old battered tomes gifted by Mr. James, up to his desk beneath the slanted roof of the farmhouse. There, by the glow of a single kerosene lamp, he waged his second battle. This was his training ground, quiet and lonely. His pencil scratched across the paper until the small hours of the morning, equations stretching across the margins like furrows in a field. He often fought sleep, his head drooping dangerously close to the pages. Sometimes he would wake with ink smudged on his cheek, a half-solved problem staring up at him accusingly. Mr. James's lessons echoed in his mind as he worked. "One problem," the old man had told him, "is like a stubborn mule. Push it from the front, and it will not move. Coax it from the side, and perhaps it will walk with you. Learn to approach from different angles." Ethan tried. He wrestled with algebraic proofs until the numbers blurred. When one approach failed, he tried another. He circled problems, tested assumptions, and when all else failed, he wrote out what he did understand, trusting that clarity would come. Often it did. Suddenly, like a door swinging open in the dark. The solution would flood his mind, elegant and simple after hours of confusion. Each breakthrough left him trembling with exhilaration, as though he had stumbled upon treasure hidden in the soil. Sometimes, Mr. James visited the farmhouse after dark, slipping through the back door with his mop bucket filled not with cleaning rags but with chalk and paper. They would work together in the barn, the lantern hanging from a nail above them. The old man's teaching was unlike anything Ethan had ever known. "To Whitmore," James said, "mathematics is a fortress. He uses it to keep others out. To me, it is a field. Anyone who tends it carefully may reap its harvest. You boy already know how to tend a field. He drew a simple problem on the barn wall with chalk, a triangle, its sides labeled. Prove the Pythagorean theorem, James challenged. Ethan hesitated. He had seen it before in his textbooks, but to prove it himself was different. He bent over the chalkboard, trying one line of reasoning, then another. He grew frustrated, his hands clenched, sweat dampening his brow. James only watched, silent. At last, Ethan groaned, "It won't work." The old man shook his head. "Do not say it won't work. Say instead, it will work, but I have not yet found how. Hope, boy, is half the proof." Ethan stared at the triangle again. He tried rearranging the squares, shifting his thinking. Hours passed. Then suddenly the pattern revealed itself, areas fitting together like puzzle pieces. He gasped, his chalk racing across the board. When he finished, James's eyes glistened. "Yes, that's it. And now you know. The answer was always there. You only needed patience enough to uncover it." The nights were not easy. Some ended in triumph, others in despair. Ethan sometimes slammed his fist on the table, angry at his own mind. But each time he wanted to give up, he remembered Whitmore's smirk, the whispers of his classmates, and the image of his brother Daniel pointing at the stars. Failure was not an option. Not this time. His parents noticed the change. One night, his mother stepped quietly into his room and found him hunched over a notebook, circles of light and shadow under his eyes. "Ethan," she said gently, "you'll wear yourself thin." He looked up, blinking. "I have to be ready." She touched his hair, smoothing it back like she had when he was little. "Your father and I never dreamed of this for you. We only hoped you'd grow strong, keep the farm alive. But if numbers are your harvest, then sow them well. Just promise me you won't lose your kindness in the struggle." Ethan nodded. "Kindness is the only thing I won't give up." At school, Whitmore tightened his grip. He handed out tests filled with puzzles meant to confuse. He coldly called Ethan to the board, forcing him to solve problems under the stares of the class. But slowly, Ethan began to change. He no longer froze under pressure. He drew from the nights of solitude, from the barn where he had proven theorems with trembling hands. His writing on the board was steady, his explanations clear. Some students began to whisper not with scorn, but with awe. Whitmore noticed, too. His eyes narrowed each time Ethan solved what should have been impossible. And with each success, the teacher's disdain deepened. One night, after finishing his chores, Ethan collapsed at his desk, utterly drained. The exam was drawing closer. His pencil rolled from his hand. He wanted nothing more than to sleep. Then he heard James's voice in memory. "Mathematics is a field. If you neglect it, weeds will grow. If you nurture it, it will feed you." Groaning, Ethan sat up again. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and began once more. This was his training in the dark, nights of exhaustion, days of ridicule, but also the quiet victories of a mind learning to endure. And though he did not yet know it, these trials were not just preparing him for Whitmore's exam. They were shaping him into something far greater, a soul capable of standing steady against injustice, armed with patience, humility, and the light of truth. The farm boy who worked the soil by day was also cultivating a harvest of another kind by night. In the dim glow of the kerosene lamp, between the creak of barn timbers and the cries of owls outside, a genius was being forged. And soon, the whole town would witness what had been born in silence. In every battle, there comes a moment when the opponent sharpens his blade in secret. For Ethan Miller, that blade was being forged in the office of Richard Whitmore. The teacher sat alone one evening, his desk lamp burning, papers spread before him like maps of a battlefield. His pen scratched across the page, each stroke carrying not the spirit of education, but the spirit of vengeance. Whitmore had been teaching for 30 years. In all that time, no student had ever scored a perfect 100 on his exams. This was no accident. He built his tests like fortresses, walls of complexity, mazes of half-formed problems, traps laid not to measure knowledge, but to humiliate. But this time, humiliation was not enough. A farm boy had dared to accept his challenge, and worse, rumors whispered through the halls that the boy might actually succeed. Whitmore's pride could not endure such a wound, so he plotted. He filled the first pages with problems from advanced algebra, far beyond middle school level. Equations sprawling across the page, demanding techniques Ethan had only begun to glimpse. The next section he made crueler. Geometry riddles with missing details, diagrams intentionally misleading, problems that could be interpreted in more than one way. Then he turned to probability and statistics, planting questions so tangled they bordered on nonsense. A student might spend an hour on one and still emerge empty-handed. Finally, at the end, he placed a problem drawn from number theory, a question with no known solution, not even among the greatest mathematicians alive. Whitmore leaned back, a cold smile on his lips. Let the boy try. Let him stumble before the whole school. Let everyone see that dirt-stained boots can never walk the halls of true scholarship. But Whitmore's schemes did not end with the paper itself. He petitioned the principal to host the exam not in a classroom, but in the grand assembly hall, before the eyes of students, teachers, and parents. It will be inspiring, he said smoothly, to see one of our brightest put to the test. In truth, it was theater. Whitmore wanted Ethan's failure to be public, undeniable, and unforgettable. Whispers spread quickly. By the week's end, the entire school buzzed with anticipation. They're making him take it on the stage. In front of everyone? Yes, even the local newspaper's sending a reporter. He doesn't stand a chance. Students placed wagers behind the gym. Some bet on how many questions Ethan would answer before breaking down. Others bet he would walk out before the end. Ethan heard the whispers. Each one stung, but none pierced deeper than Whitmore's cold stare during class. One day, as Ethan passed through the hall, Whitmore stopped him. "You know," the teacher said softly, his voice like frost, "pride has destroyed greater men than you. Do you really think you can outwit me? Do you think your farm chores prepare you for the rigors of mathematics?" Ethan lifted his gaze. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I don't need to outwit you, sir. I just need to be honest with the problems." Whitmore sneered. Honesty is useless in a world that rewards only victory. But Ethan did not answer. He walked on, his silence more defiant than any insult. At night, in the barn under the lantern's glow, Ethan told Mr. James about the planned spectacle. The old janitor's eyes darkened. "So he intends to turn scholarship into a circus." Ethan nodded. "Everyone will be watching." James placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then let them. You do not study to please a crowd. You study to uncover truth. If you face a problem with missing data, explain it. If you face a riddle without a solution, show why. That is more powerful than any answer." "But what if I freeze?" Ethan whispered. James leaned closer. "Remember the farm. Remember the nights you stared at a stubborn equation until dawn. You are not a boy pretending to be a scholar. You are a scholar already. Whitmore only hopes you have forgotten it." Ethan breathed deeply. For a moment, the fear receded. Still, Whitmore's pressure grew. He spoke in class of weeding out those unworthy of higher study. He dropped hints about the cruelty of the exam, savoring the dread it inspired. Other students watched Ethan with a mixture of pity and awe. Some whispered encouragement in the halls, others avoided him entirely, as if failure might be contagious. But a few, Jessica, Tommy, Brian, stepped quietly to his side. "You won't be alone up there," Jessica said firmly one lunch hour. "Even if we can't take the test for you, we'll be there cheering." Ethan smiled faintly. "Thank you. But it's not just about me. If I lose, every farm kid after me loses too." The others exchanged glances. They realized, perhaps for the first time, the weight he carried. Meanwhile, Whitmore prepared his stage. He rehearsed the announcement he would make when Ethan stumbled, words polished to sound righteous but designed to sting. He imagined the look on the boy's face when the problems defeated him, the laughter of the crowd, the headlines in the paper. He believed the outcome was already written. But in the shadows of the barn, Ethan was writing a different ending, an ending forged through sleepless nights, relentless patience, and the quiet guidance of a janitor who refused to let knowledge die. The exam date was set. Posters went up around the school. Public examination, advanced mathematics, Ethan Miller to attempt the final. Students gasped. Teachers raised eyebrows. Parents murmured at dinner tables. Some praised Whitmore for his boldness. Others shook their heads at the cruelty. And in the Miller farmhouse, Ethan sat by the window, staring at the dark fields stretching into the horizon. The wind stirred the corn stalks like waves of an ocean. His father entered quietly. "You ready, son?" Ethan's hands tightened on his pencil. "I don't know if I'll get every answer, but I'll face every question." The father nodded. "That's all a man can do. And sometimes, it's enough." Outside, the night deepened. In a week's time, the hall would be filled. Whitmore's schemes would unfold, and the boy with mud on his boots would step into the light. The teacher believed he had built an unscalable wall. But Ethan Miller was not preparing to climb it. He was preparing to walk straight through. In the days that followed, the school hallways pulsed with anticipation. Posters of the upcoming examination glared from the walls like silent judges. Students pointed as Ethan walked past, their voices dropping to whispers, their eyes filled with curiosity or scorn. He carried it all with his usual quietness, but silence can be heavy. At times, it pressed on him like the weight of the plow his father dragged across the fields. Yet something began to stir, quietly at first, then stronger. One afternoon in the cafeteria, as Ethan sat alone over a simple lunch, an apple, a piece of bread tucked from home, Jessica slid into the seat across from him. She was tall, sharp-eyed, her notebooks always filled with tidy handwriting. "You don't have to sit by yourself," she said, opening her milk carton. Ethan looked up, startled. "It's fine. I'm used to it." "That's not the point," she replied firmly. "The whole school is treating this like some kind of circus, but what you're doing, it matters, and you don't have to do it alone." Before Ethan could respond, Tommy and Brian joined, trays clattering as they sat down. Tommy grinned, boyish and reckless. Brian was quieter, but his presence solid. Tommy leaned in. "We've been talking. We want to help." Ethan blinked. "Help? How?" Jessica tapped her pencil on the table. "Study group. Lunch breaks, after school, whenever we can. We'll go over problems together. Not because we're smarter than you, we know you're ahead of us, but because sometimes explaining to others makes your thinking sharper." Ethan hesitated. He had grown so accustomed to solitude that the thought of allies felt foreign, but when he saw the sincerity in their faces, something softened. "All right," he said at last. "Let's try." The next day, the group gathered in the library. The librarian, curious but kindly, let them occupy a back table. Stacks of textbooks surrounded them. Jessica drilled Ethan on definitions. Tommy tossed out quick-fire problems. Brian patiently double-checked every step. At first, it was clumsy. Ethan was unused to speaking his thoughts aloud. But soon, he found a rhythm. Teaching his friends clarified his own reasoning. Their questions revealed gaps he had not noticed. Laughter even slipped in now and then, easing the weight he carried. "See?" Jessica said one afternoon as Ethan corrected her geometry proof. "You're not just preparing for Whitmore's exam, you're teaching us too." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the point." Word of the study group spread. Some mocked it, calling it the Farm Kids Fan Club. But others watched with quiet admiration. For the first time, the story was not only about Whitmore's cruelty, it was about resilience, about friendship forged in defiance of injustice. Then, one evening, as Ethan packed his books in the library, a stranger approached. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind but weary eyes and a leather bag slung over her shoulder. "You're Ethan Miller?" she asked. He nodded cautiously. She extended her hand. "Dr. Helen Foster. I'm a child psychologist. I read about your situation in the local paper. What Whitmore is doing, making a child take a public exam as a spectacle, isn't just cruel. It's damaging. It's called academic gatekeeping, and it has to be challenged." Ethan blinked. The words were unfamiliar, heavy with importance. Dr. Foster continued. "I'd like to support you, not with answers, those must be yours, but with guidance. Breathing techniques for focus, strategies to manage the stress. Because when the hall fills with hundreds of eyes, it won't only be mathematics that tests you, it will be your nerves." Ethan listened intently, grateful for help he hadn't known he needed. The very next week, another ally appeared. At a town meeting, a lawyer named Samuel Green spoke out. "We cannot allow education to be weaponized against children from poor families. This isn't just about one boy. It's about every student who has been told they do not belong." Ethan heard about it from his father, who returned from the meeting with eyes brighter than usual. "People are starting to notice, son. You're fighting for more than yourself now." The weight on Ethan's shoulders grew heavier, but strangely, it no longer felt like a burden he carried alone. One evening in the barn, under the glow of the lantern, Ethan told Mr. James about his new allies. The old janitor chuckled, his voice gravelly but warm. "A farm boy, a handful of friends, a psychologist, a lawyer, not quite an army, but perhaps enough." Ethan tilted his head. "Do you think I can really win?" James grew serious. "Winning is not always measured by the score on a page. Sometimes it is measured by how many rise because you dared to stand." He pointed to the crate of books. "When I was cast out of the university, I thought knowledge had died with me. But here you are, carrying it forward. Whether you score 100 or not, you have already proven something. That brilliance can bloom in the most unlikely soil." Ethan's chest tightened, a mix of pride and fear. He realized that failure would not just be his own, it would ripple across everyone who now looked to him as a symbol. But then he remembered Jessica's laughter in the library, Dr. Foster's calm voice, the lawyer's fiery speech, his parents' quiet faith, and James's steady hand on his shoulder. For the first time, he felt something larger than fear. He felt the stirrings of a movement. As the exam day drew closer, the study group pressed harder. Lunchtimes were filled with equations. Evenings brought sessions with Dr. Foster, who taught Ethan how to breathe steadily under pressure, how to slow his racing thoughts. Meanwhile, Whitmore grew more restless. He could sense the shift. His prey was no longer cornered and alone. The farm boy had found allies, and that made him dangerous. So Whitmore doubled down. He added more impossible problems to the exam, whispered to colleagues about the need to uphold standards, and sneered whenever he saw Ethan surrounded by friends. But what he could not see was that every sneer only strengthened Ethan's resolve. On the night before the exam, Ethan sat on the farmhouse porch, looking out over the darkened fields. The stars shone like silent witnesses. His father sat beside him, silent at first, then said quietly, "You've stirred something, Ethan. You've shown people that courage doesn't always come from those in power. Sometimes it comes from a boy with muddy boots." Ethan looked at his father, then back at the stars. "I don't know if I'll win tomorrow." The father placed a rough hand on his son's shoulder. "You've already won more than most men ever do." And in that moment, with the fields stretching wide around him and the sky endless above, Ethan felt a calm settle over him. Whatever happened, he would not face it alone. The farm boy had found his allies, and together they were ready to face the storm. The final week arrived like a tightening rope. Each sunrise brought Ethan closer to the moment he would step into the assembly hall, closer to the test that had become more than an exam. It was a trial of dignity, of hope, of justice. Everywhere he walked, the air was thick with expectation. Students craned their necks when he passed. Teachers whispered in corners. Parents at the grocery store pointed him out as the farm boy who's going to challenge Whitmore. Ethan bore it quietly, but inside his heart raced. He knew he could not simply prepare with numbers on a page. Whitmore's trap was not only intellectual, it was psychological. The teacher wanted to crush him beneath the weight of the crowd. It was Mr. James who named the truth. "He doesn't want to measure your knowledge," the old janitor said one evening as they worked in the barn under the flickering lantern. "He wants to break your composure. He wants the pressure to do the work he cannot." Ethan frowned. "So how do I prepare for that?" James's eyes glimmered. "We create the pressure ourselves, before he does." The next day, their training changed. James gathered the study group, Jessica, Tommy, and Brian into the barn. He handed out chalk, set up old blackboards, and declared, "From now until the exam, this place will be our arena." He turned on a rusty radio, its speakers crackling with static and sudden bursts of music. He hung extra lanterns so the light glared harshly, casting long shadows. Tommy banged on buckets. Jessica shouted interruptions. Brian pretended to whisper rumors from the crowd. Through it all, Ethan worked. His pencil moved across the paper as distractions swirled around him. Sometimes he stumbled, his concentration faltering. James would stop him. "Again," the old man said. "Stay steady." The problem is the same, whether in silence or chaos. Night after night, they repeated the drill. Each time, Ethan grew calmer, his focus sharper. He learned to breathe slowly, to center himself no matter the noise. Dr. Foster joined as well, teaching Ethan techniques she had given to anxious children in countless classrooms. "Plant your feet firmly," she told him. "Feel the ground. Imagine roots growing down from you into the earth. No storm can move you if your roots hold." Ethan tried. When the others shouted, he closed his eyes for a moment, imagined the fields of home beneath his boots, the solid soil of Iowa. He remembered the way his father steadied the plow, the way his mother hummed as she worked. He drew strength from those roots, and when he opened his eyes, the problem on the page remained clear. One night, James gave him a problem deliberately flawed, an equation missing a constant, a geometry figure drawn impossibly. Ethan wrestled with it, frustration building. "It doesn't make sense!" he cried. James leaned close, his voice firm. "And what will you do when Whitmore hands you the same? Will you panic? Or will you turn the trap against him?" Ethan froze, then thought carefully. He took a new sheet of paper and began writing. If the constant is assumed to be x, then the solution follows this path. If instead it is y, then we arrive at this result. When he finished, he looked up. Show the possibilities. Expose the flaw. James's eyes gleamed. Exactly. Truth is not afraid of ambiguity. It reveals it, names it, and then moves beyond. That lesson stayed with Ethan. For the first time, he felt ready not just for Whitmore's knowledge, but for his tricks. Meanwhile, the study group grew into something larger. More students began stopping by the barn after school, curious at first, then inspired. Some brought their own problems, others just watched. Soon the place buzzed with voices, chalk dust floating in the lantern light. It was no longer just Ethan's fight. It had become a community. Jessica once whispered to him as they packed up, "Do you realize what's happening? Whitmore tried to isolate you, but you've built something bigger instead. You've turned his challenge into a gathering." Ethan only smiled. He did not feel like a leader, but he could not deny the truth. At home, his parents noticed the change as well. His father watched him practicing late into the night, the light glowing through the farmhouse window. "You've grown, Ethan," he said one morning as they worked side by side repairing the fence. "Not just taller, stronger in here," he tapped his chest. "Whatever happens in that hall, you've already proven more than I ever dreamed." Ethan looked down, his throat tight. "I just hope I don't let everyone down." His father shook his head. "You won't, because standing is enough. Win or lose, you've already stood." As the final days passed, Ethan began to carry himself differently. His steps steadier, his gaze clearer. Whitmore noticed, too, and it unsettled him. One afternoon, Whitmore cornered Ethan after class. "You think you've prepared for me?" he sneered. "You think your little group will save you?" Ethan met his eyes. For the first time, there was no fear. "I don't need saving. I only need to be honest with the problems." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "We'll see." The night before the exam, Ethan sat again on the porch, the fields stretching quiet beneath the stars. His mother brought him a blanket, laying it over his shoulders. "You're ready," she said softly. "I don't know if I'll get everything right," he admitted. She smiled, brushing his hair back. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that you'll walk into that hall with courage, and courage is rarer than answers." Ethan looked out at the fields, their rows stretching endless, and felt a calm he had never known before. He had trained in chaos, faced impossible problems, steadied his mind under pressure. He had roots now, deeper than any storm could shake. And as he rose to go inside, he whispered to himself, "I am ready." The morning arrived cloaked in silence. Even the farm seemed to hold its breath. Ethan woke before dawn, the sky just beginning to pale above the fields. He pulled on his worn boots, washed his face in the cold basin water, and stood for a long moment by the window. The fields stretched out endlessly, rows of soil glistening with dew. Somewhere in those rows, his brother's laughter still lingered, his parents' sweat still glistened. The land had shaped him, its hardships, its patience, its quiet endurance. Today he would carry it with him into the hall. His father drove him to the school in their dented pickup. Neither spoke much. Words were too small for what lay ahead. But before Ethan stepped out, his father gripped his shoulder with rough hands. "Stand tall," he said simply. "Win or lose, stand tall." Ethan nodded. The assembly hall was already packed. Rows upon rows of students, teachers, and parents filled the wooden benches. Reporters from the local paper set up cameras. The air buzzed with excitement, like a fairground before the show. At the front, on a raised stage, stood a single desk. A spotlight shone upon it, harsh and unrelenting. Behind the desk loomed a giant screen where the exam problems would be projected for all to see. Whitmore stood at the side, papers clutched in his hand, his expression stern, almost regal. He relished the spectacle. Today, he thought, the farm boy would be broken and his authority restored. When Ethan entered, the murmurs swelled. Some gasped at his youth, just 12, his shoulders narrow, his boots still stained from the morning mud. Others whispered predictions of how quickly he would fail. Ethan walked slowly, his face calm, though his heart thundered. He reached the desk, placed his pencil neatly before him, and sat. The spotlight burned hot on his skin. For a moment he closed his eyes and remembered Dr. Foster's voice. Roots into the earth. No storm can move you if your roots hold. He imagined the soil beneath him, the fields of home, his father's steady hand. When he opened his eyes, the fear had settled into quiet focus. Whitmore stepped forward. His voice boomed through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you will witness a lesson. This boy has claimed he can achieve the impossible. A perfect score on my examination. We shall see if pride truly precedes the fall." He pressed a button. The first problem appeared on the screen. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was far beyond the curriculum, a problem in advanced algebra, dense with symbols. Ethan read it once, then again. His pencil touched the paper. Slowly, carefully, he began to write. His movements were steady, deliberate. Lines formed, equations unfolded. Within minutes, the impossible melted into clarity. He set down his pencil, raised his head. Answer 47. On the screen, his work was displayed. A hush swept the hall. Even the skeptical teachers leaned forward, impressed. The next problem appeared. A geometry puzzle. The diagram intentionally misleading. Angles missing. Ethan studied it. He felt the trap immediately. Whitmore had not given enough data. The crowd held its breath, waiting for him to stumble. Instead, Ethan calmly stood. His voice, though quiet, carried through the microphone. This problem cannot be solved as written. However, if we assume the missing angle is 90 degrees, then the area is 128. If instead it is 60 degrees, then the result is 74. Both are valid depending on the correction. Murmurs erupted. He had not been caught. He had exposed the flaw. Parents clapped softly. Students exchanged wide-eyed glances. Whitmore's face darkened. The problems grew harder. Probability riddles twisted like thorny vines. Statistics questions seemed endless. But Ethan moved through them with surprising grace. When he faltered, he breathed, rooted himself, and pressed on. The hall grew silent, save for the sound of his pencil. Even the reporters forgot their cameras for a time, caught in the unfolding drama. Then came the final problem. When it flashed on the screen, a murmur of disbelief ran through the audience. It was a problem drawn from number theory, known among mathematicians as unsolved, the kind of riddle that had haunted scholars for centuries. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He knew it was impossible to give a definitive answer. Whitmore had planted it as the final humiliation. The boy sat still. The hall seemed to lean forward, waiting for him to break. Then Ethan rose. His voice trembled at first, but grew steadier as he spoke. This problem has no known solution. To place it on a test is not a measure of knowledge, but of cruelty. Yet even here there is something to learn. I will explain what we do know, and why it matters. He walked to the blackboard, chalk in hand. He outlined the history of the problem, the patterns mathematicians had discovered, the approaches that had failed. He showed what the question revealed about the beauty of primes, about the search for order in chaos. He did not solve the unsolvable. He illuminated it. When he finished, the hall erupted in applause. Students stood. Parents clapped until their hands ached. Some teachers had tears in their eyes. At the side of the stage, Whitmore stood frozen, his face pale. He had expected a collapse. Instead, he had been exposed. His traps had turned into triumphs, his cruelty into the stage for a revelation. The head of the mathematics department, an elderly professor invited to witness the exam, stepped forward. He held Ethan's paper in his hand, his voice clear. Every problem he could solve, he solved. Every flaw, he exposed. Even the unsolved, he illuminated with wisdom beyond his years. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a perfect score. The hall thundered. Cheers echoed against the rafters. Ethan stood small at the center of it all, his face flushed, his hands trembling. Yet inside he felt only calm. He had not come to humiliate Whitmore. He had come to be honest with the problems, and honesty had carried him further than arrogance ever could. From the back of the hall, Mr. James wiped at his eyes with a rough sleeve. For years he had carried the ashes of his own defeat, believing the fire of knowledge had been extinguished. But here it was, burning again in the hands of a boy who had never asked for power, only for truth. On that day, the farm boy with muddy boots became something more. Not just a student, not just a challenger, but a symbol. That genius can grow in any soil, that dignity cannot be silenced, and that even in the face of impossible tests, courage can rewrite the ending. And though the cheers roared around him, Ethan only bowed his head for a moment, whispering to himself, "This is for you, Daniel." His brother's dream had not died. It had walked into the light with him. The assembly hall did not quiet for a long time. Applause rolled like thunder, wave after wave, as if the walls themselves wanted to remember the sound. Ethan stood at the center, flushed and humble, his small frame almost swallowed by the storm of voices. But at the edge of the stage, Richard Whitmore did not clap. He stood rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes burning. The man who had built his reputation on unbreakable walls had just watched a farm boy walk straight through them. When the applause finally dimmed, Whitmore stepped forward, his voice sharp, desperate. "This is a charade," he barked. "He didn't solve the final problem. He only talked around it. He twisted my exam into a speech." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The head of the mathematics department raised a hand, silencing the room. "On the contrary," the professor said calmly, the boy recognized an unsolved problem. He explained it with clarity and integrity. That is scholarship at its highest level. And as for the rest of the exam, his work is flawless. There is no argument left. Whitmore's face reddened. He opened his mouth, but words failed. The newspapers carried the story the very next morning. Farm boy stuns school with perfect score, 12-year-old outsmarts impossible exam. Photographs showed Ethan at the chalkboard, his boots muddy, his hair unkempt, his expression serene. For the town, it was a miracle story, hope blooming from the humblest soil. But for Whitmore, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Teachers whispered of his cruelty. Parents wrote letters to the school board. Students told stories of impossible exams, of humiliation disguised as rigor. Dr. Helen Foster, the psychologist who had supported Ethan, went further. She wrote a public article condemning Whitmore's methods as academic gatekeeping, designed to exclude rather than educate. When learning is turned into a weapon, she wrote, it ceases to be learning at all. The article spread beyond the town. Soon, state officials took notice. An investigation began. At first, Whitmore resisted, insisting he was a victim of overreaction. But as files were opened, patterns emerged. Decades of exams filled with traps, complaints buried, students discouraged. Then came the testimony of Mr. James. For years he had remained silent, mopping floors, carrying his past like a hidden wound. But now, seeing Ethan vindicated, he stepped forward. In a hushed boardroom before school officials and reporters, the old man told his story. "I once stood where Whitmore stands now," James said, his voice steady despite the weight of years. "I was a professor of mathematics, but I refused to falsify a grade for a powerful man's son. For that refusal, I was cast out. Whitmore was among those who looked the other way, who allowed injustice to prevail. And now, I see the same cruelty turned upon a child." The room fell silent. The truth could no longer be hidden. Whitmore's downfall was swift. The school board demanded his resignation. Parents demanded more. Soon, legal proceedings began, investigating not just his actions, but the network of educators who had supported the same philosophy, keeping the gates of learning locked against the poor, the rural, the different. Some tried to defend him, claiming he had upheld standards, but the tide had turned. The image of Ethan at the chalkboard, calm and clear, was stronger than any excuse. Whitmore left the school under a cloud of disgrace. No applause followed him, no gratitude, only silence, the kind that swallows a man who built his life on arrogance and watched it collapse. For Ethan, the days after the exam were strange. Fame touched him briefly, reporters at the farm, interviews he shied away from. He answered politely, but never with pride. "I only did my best," he told them. "Math is not about defeating anyone. It's about seeing clearly." But privately, he struggled with the weight of it all. He had never sought to destroy a man, only to prove his own worth. Yet Whitmore's fall was tied to his triumph. One evening he confessed this to Mr. James. "I didn't want to ruin him," Ethan said, his voice low. "I only wanted to show that farm kids belong too." James placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't ruin him, Ethan. He ruined himself. Pride was his undoing. You only held up the mirror." The boy nodded slowly. The truth was heavy, but it was freeing too. Life at school changed. Students who had once mocked him now greeted him with respect. Some even asked for help with their homework. Teachers looked at him differently, some with admiration, others with guilt. Jessica, Tommy, and Brian remained closest. They teased him about being the most famous farm boy in Iowa, but in their eyes was pride, not envy. Dr. Foster told him, "What you did will ripple further than you know. Children who feel small will hear your story and stand a little taller." And when the local lawyer, Samuel Green, spoke again at the town hall, he said, "This is more than one victory. It is proof that brilliance belongs to no single class, no single place. It belongs wherever courage and curiosity live." As for Mr. James, the shadows that had followed him seemed to lift. Students no longer saw just a janitor. They saw the man who had believed in Ethan before anyone else. Some began asking him questions, lingering to hear his stories. One day, Ethan asked him quietly, "Do you regret teaching me in secret? It cost you safety." James smiled, eyes moist. "Regret? No. For years I thought my light had gone out. But you carried it further than I ever could. That is no regret. That is redemption." And so, while Whitmore's name faded in disgrace, Ethan's story spread. Not as a tale of conquest, but as a lesson. That education is not a fortress, and genius is not bound by wealth or status. The fall of Whitmore was not the end. It was the clearing of the field, the breaking of hard ground. In that space, new seeds could be planted. Ethan had shown that honesty and persistence could withstand cruelty. He had proven that a boy with muddy boots could stand before the world and not be shaken. And though he remained humble, working the farm by day and studying by night, he carried within him a truth stronger than any exam score. That knowledge, when shared with integrity, can topple the proud and lift the forgotten. And in that truth, Whitmore's fortress crumbled, brick by brick, until nothing remained but the lesson his downfall left behind. Winter came quietly to the Miller farm. Frost silvered the fields, and the sheep huddled close in the barn. The land lay bare, waiting for spring. And in that silence, Ethan Miller found himself in a new season of life, too. The storm of headlines had passed. The reporters stopped coming. The whispers at school faded into normal chatter. Whitmore was gone, his name spoken less each week, his legacy crumbling like an abandoned house on the edge of town. What remained was not scandal, but possibility. It began with a letter. One evening, the postman brought an envelope stamped with the seal of a university. Inside was an offer, a scholarship to a summer program at MIT, reserved for young talents across the nation. Ethan read the words once, twice, his hands trembling. His mother pressed a hand to her mouth, tears in her eyes. His father, usually silent, simply said, "The boy who worked these fields will now walk where great minds have walked. Go, son. Learn what we never could." Ethan smiled, though shyly. "I'll go, but I'll come back too. I promise." At school, changes began as well. The board introduced new policies to ensure fairness in advanced classes. Teachers who had once dismissed students from poor families were now asked to reevaluate how they measured talent. And students themselves, some from farms, some from struggling households, began to believe they might belong in those seats after all. It was Jessica who first suggested it. "We should start something," she said one afternoon in the library. "A group, a program, something for kids who think they're not good enough. We'll help them, like we helped you. Pass it on." The idea spread. With the support of Dr. Foster and lawyer Samuel Green, a local scholarship fund was born, the Farm Boy Mathematics Initiative. It offered tutoring, books, and encouragement for students who felt locked out of higher learning. The first recipients were children from nearby farms, kids who came to school with dirt on their boots, just like Ethan. They sat in the same library where he had once studied alone, but now they were surrounded by mentors and allies. A seed had been planted. For Ethan, life became a balance between two worlds. By day, he still did chores, feeding animals, hauling water, repairing fences. The rhythm of farm life kept him grounded. But by night, he devoured new books sent from Boston, his mind stretching into realms of science and discovery. He wrote letters to professors at MIT, asking questions about geometry, number theory, physics. To his surprise, many wrote back. They marveled at his curiosity, his humility, his clarity of thought. One professor wrote, "You remind me of what mathematics is truly for, not prestige, but wonder." And yet, through all the excitement, Ethan never forgot Daniel, his brother. On quiet nights, he would walk into the pasture, look at the stars, and whisper, "We're still learning together." In those whispers lived the truest victory. Spring returned, and with it, the fields stirred to life again. Ethan helped his father plant, his hands in the soil. But he also began something new. On Saturdays, children from neighboring farms gathered in the Miller barn. Wooden benches were set up, a blackboard nailed to the wall, and there by lantern light Ethan taught. He taught them not only arithmetic and fractions, but the beauty hidden in patterns. He showed them how triangles whispered secrets, how numbers told stories, how the stars overhead could be measured and mapped. The children listened wide-eyed, their laughter echoing in the rafters. Math, Ethan told them, isn't a fortress. It's a field, and anyone willing to plant seeds of effort can harvest its fruit. Those words, once spoken by James, had become Ethan's own. The torch had been passed, and now he carried it forward. As for Mr. James, he no longer walked the halls as invisible. Students greeted him with respect. Teachers asked his advice, and on Saturdays he sat proudly at the back of Ethan's barn lessons, watching with quiet joy. "You've become the teacher I once dreamed of being," he told Ethan one evening. Ethan shook his head. "I'm only beginning." James smiled. "That is what makes you a teacher." And so, the story of the farm boy did not end with a perfect score. It did not end with Whitmore's fall. It grew into something larger, something that could not be contained in grades or reports. It became a legacy. Years later, when people spoke of Ethan Miller, they did not only remember the day he solved Whitmore's impossible exam, they remembered the barn filled with children, the scholarships for the poor, the letters exchanged with great scholars. They remembered that hope had been planted in the humblest soil, and it had grown tall. And for those who sat by the fire in their old age, telling the tale to grandchildren, it was never just a story of mathematics. It was the story of a boy who proved that dignity and genius could wear muddy boots, that truth could stand unshaken before arrogance, and that kindness could carry knowledge further than pride ever could. In the end, Ethan's greatest answer was not written on paper. It was written in lives changed, in futures opened, in seeds sown for tomorrow. And as the fields turned green again, swaying gently in the spring breeze, one could almost hear his brother's voice carried in the wind. "You did it, Ethan. You carried the dream." Thank you for sitting by the fire with me, listening to the story of a farm boy who dared to dream. If this tale warmed your heart, I invite you to stay. Subscribe so you can join me again when the next story begins. Every story is a seed, and together we can keep planting hope.